we're like at a crossroads because economically the things that are happening right now are unheard of in our lifetimes. If we continue on this path, the interest on our debt alone, which is when these T-bills expire and we have to reload them essentially, there'll be nothing else. Like there will be no spending on Social Security. There will be no spending on Medicare because everything is going to refinance the debt. This is bound for destruction, but it doesn't have to be. This is a solvable problem. Our Federal Reserve is at war, I believe on our behalf, with the European central banks. We don't get a say in whether or not we have a central bank. Yes, the power of the people, the vote, whatever, but we don't get a say. The only say we get is how much we can distance ourselves and become autonomous. We have to deal with the environment that we are in, and we can optimize within it. All right, hey, what is up? This is solo episode number 3. No idea if this is going to come out again after the last 2 solo episodes. The last 2 I was talking about central banking. I was talking about monetary policy, fractional reserve banking, reserve currency, and the Triffin dilemma. I want to shift a little bit here, and this is probably something that I should be talking about with Brian. Brian, I need you back, man. It's weird. I don't know what to do with my hands doing these solo episodes. It's unnerving a little bit at first. I feel a little more comfortable now, but just like when we first started recording initially, when we launched this podcast, I just felt like over and over I'm having to restart. It's a strange feeling just talking into your camera and your microphone, but getting a little bit used to it. But I do like having Brian here because having the back and forth makes it a little more natural. You can kind of compose your thoughts. But I am so excited to talk about economics, and I really, even though I like our back and forth and I like being able to have that conversation sort of flow, it's a good outlet to have. I can just talk into the microphone and talk about economics, and I love talking about finances and economics, particularly macroeconomics. Like that is my jam. And so it is nice to just be able to talk, and maybe nobody listens. Maybe these episodes just fall off a cliff when I'm doing this. But I want to read through a newsletter from our friend Joe Withrow, because I think that Joe has dialed into something that a lot of the economic world is missing. I feel like I fairly thoroughly track the economic news, what's happening in the overall economy. I'm a big student of personal finance, and I have been for a long time. But the more you learn about the macro of it, we have microeconomics and macroeconomics. And in college, undergrad, you start with micro, and then you have a macro. Same thing in grad school. You have a couple of each, and they're sort of separate. But the more I learn about macro is where you learn how things work. Micro is how you apply it in your own life. But when we only learn the micro side of it, and that's based on a lot of models that I don't really think are that accurate, or models are just guesses. And I think that this, equilibrium, supply demand, all of the models that we work on in grad school economic classes, I've looked back through my binders to see if what I can pull out to see what makes sense or what we could talk about, because I want to apply lessons learned. And in the same vein of the last 2 solo episodes I've done talking about macroeconomics, talking about central banking, I want to see these discussions that we're all having. If you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to it because you have a personal interest in this. We're having these discussions from our lens, which is mostly interested in IBC, interested in taking control of your capital, interested in severing from Wall Street. But if you're going to sever from Wall Street, you need to know why, and you need to know what Wall Street's doing. And we have a good idea of what they're doing, but it's always good to understand the why. I said recently, you should be able to steelman the argument of your opponent if you want to have a comprehensive argument for yourself. And so reading through what they're writing, what they're putting out, I think is very helpful. And Joe Withrow, the founder of the Phoenician League, I think that when I first read his book, Beyond the Nest Egg, which you can find on the remnantfinance.com/reading list or whatever, just go to remnantfinance.com, there's a tab for recommended reading. And we have links to books there that, obviously I've read, but I think of what I have read are kind of the core basis for how I have approached and learned macroeconomics. And I am not an economist, and I'm not anymore. Like, everyone listening can read the same books and get to the same understanding. There's a YouTuber. He also has in his podcast, Uneducated Economist, and he has fantastic takes on this. And I love his name of his channel because I feel like that's kind of the same as me. Even though I've technically had a lot of economics classes at the undergraduate and graduate level, they don't mean much. Ryan Griggs, who is an Austrian economist, PhD in this field, who is an IBC practitioner and probably the foremost economist in the IBC space. Brilliant, brilliant man. He says that his economic education was basically he had to unlearn everything or at least reconsider it in understanding IBC. And so it's the same way that it's like, a lot of us said, hey, I'm not a doctor, but I don't trust what I'm hearing. And if you go with the conventional mindset of like, oh, well, yeah, you're not a doctor, why would I listen to you when my doctor says to take the miracle? You know, well, that was bad advice. Like, that was patently bad advice. And now even the New York Times is admitting it. Shout out to Scott Armstrong of Rebunked News. A couple episodes ago, we posted my interview with him, or he interviewed me on his show. And he did a piece recently about the New York Times and how they're saying basically a mea culpa. And they're saying, we were so badly misled. And Scott said, no, New York Times, you were not misled. You misled us. And those of us, quote, conspiracy theorists, we were 100% right. And so how is someone like Scott, how is someone like myself and all the pilots that, like how Brian and I met, that were fighting the mandate, how were we more right than the New York Times when their sources were the CDC, were doctors, were the medical community, right? We were more right than them. And now it's conclusive. And even they're admitting it, but they're trying to do it from the perspective of we were all duped. And that's not going to fly. As the data pours in, it's becoming, unfortunately, kind of horrifically obvious that was a terrible, terrible tragedy that was foisted upon the world. So all that to say, we don't trust the experts there. We have to unlearn what we learned. And so when we said 4 or 5 years ago, hey, I'm not a doctor, but I don't recommend following your doctor's lead here. If we said that to people that we knew, or when we defended ourselves saying, hey, I'm not going to give my 6-month-old child this miracle, this medical miracle. I'm not going to give it to my 6-month-old child because it's never been tested before. And the current ongoing tests that are happening are an abysmal failure. You feel like you have to defend yourself against, it's like, well, how could you say that? I mean, my pediatrician said I should. It's like, well, objectively, they're wrong. And I'm right. And I know that. I know that I'm right, that we should not give the miracle to my 6-month-old. And now we know that. Now that's a given, of course. If you don't think that's a given, we're not going to probably work well together. You and Remnify. We don't have this common ground that we need to have the skepticism towards the financial institution if you think that the other position is valid. And so let's start there. We not outsmarted, we just logically looked at things and said, we applied critical thinking, and we said, no, I'm not going to give my 6-month-old a miracle. Even though still to this day, again, I will highlight over and over until it changes because it's preposterous. 2025, this is March 28th, 2025. The CDC schedule still prescribes 3 miracles to your child within these 72 before age 18. And so I don't need to preface this with I'm not an economist by training. And that's what Ryan Griggs says. He says, I'm a trained economist, but I had to unlearn things in order to get to the understanding of how this actually works. And so, yes, I'm not an economist, but I will give you my take. And I found reading Joe Withrow's book, Beyond the Nest Egg, to be not validation of what I thought, but just a much better articulated position on how I was thinking. In our interview with him, I believe that I mentioned a little ebook I wrote. It's too long to be an article, too short to be a book, so I'll call it an ebook. It's like a 30-page PDF. It's called IBC and the Collapse of the Dollar, because that's a common question we get because our audience understands the peril that we are in. when we have a Federal Reserve, when we have this system, and I'll go back to, it's not necessarily the Fed, it's Congress demanding the money, the Treasury trying to get what they can, and the Fed doing the rest, right? That they're all guilty. So our community questions it. Our community says, why would I spend so many of my dollars in this asset when I believe the future of the dollar is uncertain? I get that. I wrote this ebook to address those concerns, and I feel more validated now that a year's gone by or so since I didn't publish it. I just released it, and you can email us and ask for it, or we'll put it on the website, whatever. It's not like a thing that we're promoting. It's just, I just want to address that question the same way that on our blog, I try to address questions that come up frequently, and I like a visual representation of questions. And so it's just a way to answer that question. Why would I do this when I don't believe in the future of the dollar? There's my answer. I had this kind of train of thought, and I think I made a compelling case, but then I read Joe Withrow's book, and then I started having conversations with him and picking his brain on how he thought through things. And I realized that like this man is a brilliant economist, whatever economist means. His way of looking at things is a very valuable insight to what has happened and what might be happening. Of course, none of us know the future, but I want to read, and I asked his permission before. I'm going to include this, I believe, in our April newsletter because I think it's something that we should all learn. This is Joe's take on what is currently happening and his speculation, in the same way that reading his book put together pieces where I was like, hey, I had this theory, I had this idea, and the idea that was really solidified for me was he has his thesis on the global struggle and the power factions that I have referred to in the last two solo episodes, and that we referred to in our episode with him, and that he lays out in his book, which is that our Federal Reserve is at war on, I believe, on our behalf with the European central banks, because of the possible options. No matter what we want, we don't get much say. The only say we get is how much we can distance ourselves and become autonomous. So we don't get a say in whether or not we have a central bank. We just don't. Like, yes, the power of the people, the vote, whatever, but we don't get a say. We have to deal with the environment that we are in, and we can optimize within it. That's my whole premise on why I do IBC, despite my skepticism and my kind of natural inclination towards getting hard assets and preparing for the worst, etc. I'm still dealing in this dollar fiat world because I think that we can optimize on both tracks. So that's where I'm coming from. And Joe says, hey, one of these things is going to prevail. This sound money, gold standard, free economy is not going to prevail when both of these entities, the New York central banks and the Fed, versus the EU, the Keynesian idea that I discussed last time of the Bancor system, which is the central bank of central banks, which sets their own international currency, determining the monetary base that goes out to the central banks of different nations and allows them to fractionally reserve, right? It's like it's injecting another fractal layer on top of what we have, where our central bank, our state, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, does the same thing, but out to commercial banks. It's just going a layer up. It's adding another layer on top. It's further centralization, further socialization. It is a socialist economy, and like that's openly what it is. And I covered in the last one, like they don't shy away from that. They're not like, oh no, it's technically not socialist, like whatever. They want that. That's what they think is the common good. And I've read a few articles from the Encyclopedia of Central Banking where that is exactly what they want, and they're open about it, and they're not shy about it, and they don't even think it's a bad thing, which is why I believe we need to understand where they're coming from so we can better refute those arguments. And if nothing else, better prepare ourselves and our families, because that is ultimately what matters. And that's ultimately why remnant finance exists, is so that you, as a husband and father, can prepare your family against whatever they're trying to do. And so his thesis that the European central banking powers, which are waiting in the wings and currently in this epic power struggle with our central bank, I'll say we as in Americans, we're finally gaining an edge in that our Federal Reserve, our central bank is kind of slowly beating out the European central banks. They're bleeding their treasurer. They're literally bleeding their men out on the Eastern Front right now. Like, they are in a terrible situation. They claim to be fighting for democracy, but whenever democracy actually happens, they call it fascism, and they say that it's a corrupt election, and they try to overthrow and do an insider coup. Like, we've seen the playbook over and over and over. We've seen it in Georgia and Romania, and it's falling apart. Like, these countries have been fully invaded. Germany, France, England, they're not the countries they were. England's economy is like a Caribbean island right now. They're irrelevant. They're totally irrelevant, but they're still trying to play games like they're going to do reciprocal tariffs. Get out of here. It's not going to happen. Like, you have no leverage. You have nothing. And so they're falling apart. And so we are gaining an edge. And honestly, between the two options, we very much want what we have as much as we castigate it. It's like, I'll keep saying that I'm not adamantly defending the Federal Reserve and the system that we all are trying to separate ourselves from. But it's like, let's let them fight it. Let's let our side win as we slowly back away. Like Peter Griffin, we're going to slowly back out of the picture, watch what they do. We want our side to win because it looks much worse. Like, our exit from this system gets more difficult if the European Central Bank, if the Keynes Bancor system, the central bank of central banks, globalists, if they beat the New York banks and the Federal Reserve is just a cartel. It is, the Federal Reserve is the preservation of the banking interests in New York. That's what it is. That's not a good thing, but that is a better thing than what's waiting in the wings. Joe Withrow put this into words, and I'm not speaking for him. So if I'm messing up, if I'm mixing up some of what he says, like, go to our episode with him and join the Phoenician League and get his direct perspective, because he allowed me to share his content, but I'm giving my take on how I think and how his thinking has affected me. And so I want to read two newsletters that I think are fascinating because it gets right back to what we're dealing with right now and the current. We're like at a crossroads because economically the things that are happening right now are unheard of in our lifetimes. So that was a long intro, and I monologued a lot, which Brian tells me I am wont to do. So here we go. I'm going to start with an article that he wrote called Springtime for America. He says, everything is moving fast in the world of finance and economics. It's a lot to keep up with, and there's always a tug of war between narratives and counter narratives out there. But I'm starting to wonder, could it be springtime for America? Things that I didn't think were possible are starting to happen. Ideas that were once considered extreme are starting to circulate. Here's one of them. And he quotes Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Quote, think about it. Donald Trump announces the External Revenue Service, and his goal is very simple. His goal is to abolish the Internal Revenue Service and let all the outsiders pay. You see, Musk is going to cut $1 trillion. That's his job. And then we're going to get rid of all these tax scams that hammer against America, and we're going to raise $1 trillion of revenue. That's how we're going to make America great again. End quote. Joe says the above quote came from newly appointed Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick at an interview last month. Lutnick is the CEO of investment giant Cantor Fitzgerald, which also happens to be one of the 24 primary dealers within the Federal Reserve System. This is quite a privileged position to be in. The primary dealers bid on U.S. Treasuries at auction and receive direct access to the Fed's cheap financing through the discount window and repurchase or repo agreements. All that's to say that Lutnick is a true insider. He's attuned to the plumbing that underlies the dollar-based financial system. And here he was talking about abolishing the IRS. How's that for a sea change? On the surface, it doesn't look like the numbers could ever work. The challenge is that the U.S. government runs a $2 trillion budget deficit, and its largest expenses are not easy to cut. Here's a look at the biggest line items from fiscal year 2024. Social Security, 1.5 trillion. Interest payments, 1.1 trillion. That right there is the death nail. If we don't fix that, the fact that the interest is going to soon be our biggest line item, we're done. And so we need a shotgun to the face of spending right now. We don't need to worry about what AARP says about cutting Medicare for seniors. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that sounds emotional when, and this is me here, this is not Joe. That sounds emotional when we're talking about it. When you hear a politician saying it, oh, they're going to cut your Medicare, oh, they're going to cut your Social Security. Yeah, they need to. Sorry, it's going to happen in some generation of America. Like, every day, every year that goes by, the pain that the necessary destruction of Social Security and Medicare, which are Ponzi schemes, the pain of that is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So it has to happen at some point. And we don't have that much longer when, if you noticed, his Social Security is $1.5 trillion. Interest payments are $1.1 trillion. By the end of 2026, I believe, the interest on the national debt will be larger than Social Security. That's not sustainable. Like, it will, if we continue on this path, the interest on our debt alone, which is when these T-bills expire and we have to reload them essentially, there'll be nothing else. Like, there will be no spending on Social Security. There will be no spending on Medicare because everything is going to refinance the debt. If nothing changes, and all of the liberal idiots like howling about these cuts and these people are losing their jobs and the senior, whatever, like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's irrelevant because this is going away. It has to. That cannot surpass in importance the interest on the debt. Like, that, the interest on the debt will be paid first and Social Security will suffer. Eventually it'll go away. And so we're facing catastrophic collapse here, and it's a slow burn. I would say the frog in the pot analogy, but I've heard that that's not a real thing. Like, frogs don't actually do that. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, but we all know the analogy. So that's the case. Like, we're 1 or 2 degrees away from boiling. And so howling about Social Security going away and howling about how your great aunt is going to be left destitute, I mean, that is sad. And I personally know one of my favorite humans, one of my best friend's moms, is just fully dependent on Social Security. I get that. We have to strip away all of that if we're thinking about, does this even last? It's like, that has to go away. We have to pull the pin now. Even if you ease off it, you have to at least stop the growth, because that's the thing. The 1.5 trillion going to Social Security, not only is that the largest budget item expense, but it's growing and growing and growing, yet it will be surpassed by the interest. So I'll go back to his Social Security, 1.5 trillion, interest payments, 1.1 trillion, Medicare, 870 billion, defense, 826 billion. Okay. Of course, there's no way to cut the interest expense without paying off debt, which can't be done until the budget is balanced. Again, we can't deal with this continuing to fund Social Security thing, continue to fund we can't deal with it. You got a couple more years, maybe you have 10 years, but it's going away. It's objectively going away as long as we don't balance the budget, as long as the interest continues to grow. Interest is it has to be paid before Medicare. Like, it has to. There's no other, there's nothing else. So I'm going to start. I'm going to before I get too hot, I'm going to go back to Joe. Of these, there's no way to cut the interest expense without paying off the debt, which can't be done until the budget is balanced. So that leaves Social Security, Medicare, and what they call, quote, defense spending as the 3 largest line items that can be reduced. Trump has already promised not to cut anyone's Social Security or Medicare benefits. My take, that's super gay. Like, that's you're done. I mean, you have to do that. Back to Joe. In fact, he wants to eliminate the tax on Social Security, and rightfully so. That is true. While it is preposterous that Social Security still exists, it's also preposterous that you're getting taxed on it. Clearly. I mean, my 4-year-old daughter could tell you that doesn't make sense. The question is, how much overt fraud exists within these two systems? It's possible that hundreds of billions can be cut from both without impacting any living recipients. So Lutnick is confident that Elon Musk and Doge will find 1 trillion in total cuts across federal spending. That would put the annual deficit at 1 trillion, and that's where Lutnick has a trick up his sleeve. Those of us who are of the Austrian persuasion have suggested for many years now that the federal government is insolvent. If we were to honestly account for the future Social Security and Medicare commitments as an insurance company would, insurance companies being the only financial institutions that are required to maintain 100% reserves for their current liabilities, the most solvent financial institutions in the world, the most regulated institutions in the world, insurance companies. If we were to honestly account for future Social Security and Medicare commitments as an insurance company would, the federal government's liabilities would be in the $70 to $200 trillion range. We can't fathom those numbers, guys. Looking at the income statement and the $2 trillion deficit, it's obvious that those liabilities cannot be serviced from revenue. Not only can we not pay that, we are falling further into debt. We are a credit card spender who has maxed out a card. We're cruising college campuses for any free card, no credit check card that we can get, no sign up fee, and we're maxing it out in a day. We're doing that over and over and over. All right, back to it. However, we never looked at the asset side of the balance sheet. It never occurred to us to do so because it's been negligible forever. This is where the real meat comes into it. The federal government owns roughly 640 million acres of land across the country. That's roughly 28% of total land area in the United States. Hear me there. Hear Joe there. 28% of land in the United States is owned by the federal government on their asset side of the balance sheet. But they don't do anything with this land. The government doesn't even perform regular valuations to track its cumulative asset value. The federal land holdings have been a dead asset. In a similar way, the federal government owns over 261 million ounces of gold. It's the largest known gold reserve in the world. However, the government still values this gold at $42 an ounce. That means it sits on the balance sheet at just $11 billion, which is trivial in the big scheme of things. All right, let's briefly talk about gold. Gold just hit $3,100 an ounce, $3,100 for 1 ounce of gold. Yet the government is valuing its 261 million ounces at $42, $42 an ounce. 3,100 versus 42. Just keep those numbers in mind as we proceed. What Lutnick realized is that assets on the balance sheet should be valued significantly higher. He suggested that the federal government's assets total should be around 500 trillion. If that's the case, the numbers work. The government isn't insolvent. And being a Wall Street guy, Lutnick looked over the situation and he stated aloud, if we can't figure out how to generate $1 trillion in revenue on $500 trillion in assets, then we are the worst investors in the world. He's right about that. Assuming $500 trillion is the true valuation, you need to generate a 0.2% return to create $1 trillion a year in revenue. And that's where the newly created Sovereign Wealth Fund comes into play. We'll talk about their plan for it tomorrow. Okay, we talked about, I'm going to go back to those 4 biggest line item budgets. Social Security, $1.5 trillion. Interest payments, just over $1 trillion. Medicare, $0.87 trillion. And defense, $0.83 trillion. If we can, we can't make a dent in this until we can cover that interest payment. And so if we only need to make 0.2% return on the actual value of our assets, this is not a hard problem to solve. And this is the value of having Wall Street, having investors, having people who are businessmen in the White House. We've got people that have been in this world their entire careers that are now running the federal budget. That makes a lot more sense than Janet Yellen, who is a career academic who has gone up through the ranks of the same people who put modern monetary theory, the idea that as long as we can pay the interest, we can create as much money as possible. That's why we're in the situation. So having businessmen who understand this, I'll read it again. Assuming 500 trillion is the true valuation, you just need to generate 0.2% return to create 1 trillion a year in revenue. Now, maybe you have a hard time. We like the fact that there's so much open land in this country. A quarter of the land is owned by the government. We have national parks. Maybe you don't even want to touch that. Okay, let's just touch the gold, right? We said that the gold right now is $3,100 an ounce. That's what we would pay for it. That's what governments across the world would pay for it. But we listed on our balance sheet at $42 versus instead of 3,100, 3,100, and we value it at 42. So just by revaluing our gold on the balance sheet, we could generate and we could do what we do as individuals with infinite banking, with our whole life policies. We can leverage an asset that people want to borrow against or want to loan against. We can do that same thing as a nation. So that's the end of the first newsletter here. And I'm going to go to the second one because it's a follow-up here. When we left off yesterday, we were exploring the idea that it could possibly be springtime for America and our economy. I would have immediately rolled my eyes had I heard someone make such a statement even 8 months ago. After all, it's been clear for a while now that we've been hurtling towards a sovereign debt crisis in this country. Yet, the US government continued to run massive deficits and pile up even more debt regardless. It was like they were intent on skimming every last cent from their grift before the train sped over the cliff. That's what we've been saying this whole time, guys. This is bound for destruction, but it doesn't have to be. This is a solvable problem. And we finally have it seems like people intent on solving it. And it can be done without much pain. It's just we need people who are not, political economists. We need people that aren't trying to destroy America like the last administration. Back to the article here. The only way to avoid that fate is for the government to get its fiscal house in order, and soon. Nearly $17 trillion worth of U.S. treasuries are coming due over the next 3 years. That's almost half the national debt. Remember last time I said that during the Biden administration, Janet Yellen sold mostly 1-year treasury bonds because no one wants 10 years because of the uncertainty. Every other country, every other major economy, like they're smarter than us at this. They're not in this malaise of superiority being the reserve currency. That's exactly what we covered last time. We talked about the perils and the value of being the reserve currency. One of the perils is that everyone's watching you and everyone's targeting you. And we have had such a cush deal for so long. As much as we complain, even in the IBC community about this, we've had such a good deal for so long that we think it has to go on forever. We think that market has to go up and right forever. Dollar cost average, that whole idea is dependent on the market never over the long run, like not going up. And so we look at history and we look at the snapshot of time that we've had the dollar reserve currency and we see, yeah, the market's always gone up. Yeah, because everyone's demanded our dollars. Right now, people don't want our dollars 10 years from now. They want 1 year because 1 year, there's a little more certainty. And like Joe said, the train is speeding over the cliff. And so people will say, hey, I'll roll the dice for 1 year. You'll give me a good rate of return, but I'm not touching that 10 year. I mean, you got to really juice it up if I'm going to invest in you for 10 years. So no one's buying it. So they have to drive it down. That's called yield curve inversion. China is smarter than us when it comes to the economy. I know that's hard to hear because we think America capitalism, Chinese communism. That's not the case. They're learning, like from the ashes. They're rebuilding since the 70s. They're learning from us, and they are seeing what not to do as far as letting your economy run rampant and be subject to the whims of Wall Street and foreign interests who are just going to hollow out your economy. I'm going to go back to Joe here. The only way to avoid that fate is for the government to get its fiscal house in order, and soon, nearly $17 trillion worth of U.S. treasuries are coming due over the next 3 years. That's almost half the national debt. Since the U.S. government runs budget deficits each year, the only way it can repay that debt coming due is by issuing new bonds. But will the market step up to buy $17 trillion of newly issued treasuries over the next 3 years? Given that the federal debt didn't hit 17 trillion total until 2013, it took the government 224 years to amass that level of indebtedness. And now it has to reissue that much debt in just 3 years' time. That's simply not going to happen if the government continues to run $2 trillion budget deficits every year, because we're talking junkie level financial management here. And who's going to lend $17 trillion to a junkie? The good news is that there is hope. As cynical as I was about this 8 months ago, there's now a path forward to balancing the budget and to fiscal sanity. It starts with Elon Musk and Doge cutting $1 trillion in waste, fraud, and abuse within federal spending. that will cut the budget deficit in half. On the fraud, waste, and abuse, me speaking here, our episode, at this point, 5 or 6 episodes ago, called Fraud, Waste, and Abuse, has been throttled by YouTube because it's getting no views. It's like we have our consistent level of viewership and then it plummets. And that's because we were just citing the things that they found were being spent on by USAID and the State Department. If you frame LGBT in a negative light, if you frame anything related with trannies in a negative light, it's going to plummet in the algorithms. Well, whatever. That doesn't matter because yes, we want people to hear this. Yes, we want everyone to read what Joe's saying here, but we, Brian and I, Remnant Finance, we don't shy away from this because it needs to be said. When you shine a light on what the government has been funding, and then you look around and you realize, hey, why are we in this total cultural degeneracy? It makes sense when you understand what the government's been spending money on. All of these ideas that we think we have as a society, progressive ideas, they've been force-fed to us just with a fire hose of propaganda funded by our own tax dollars. It's criminal, I think. All right, going back to the article. And so they're going to cut $1 trillion fraud, waste, abuse within federal spending. That will cut the budget deficit in half. We're halfway there. From there, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick plans to create at least $1 trillion in additional revenue. That's where the newly created Sovereign Wealth Fund comes in. A sovereign wealth fund is a government-owned investment fund used to invest a country's surplus wealth. The goal is to generate extra income and meaningful returns. This is a new concept in the U.S., but the model is already being practiced in places like Norway, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore. As we noted yesterday, the federal government owns 640 million acres of land. That real estate has been a dead asset up to this point, but Lutnick is going to change that. Lutnick plans to lease chunks of federal land out to energy and mining companies. Those companies will drill for oil and natural gas and mine various metals and minerals of commercial importance. In exchange, those companies will pay the federal government a small royalty on all sales generated from federal land leases. Those royalties will reside in America's Sovereign Wealth Fund. Picture oil rigs humming in Alaska and Wyoming, lithium mines buzzing in Utah, copper mines operating in Nevada, each cranking out cheap energy and metals of critical importance. If the royalty rate was a conservative 5%, Uncle Sam would receive $5 billion from every $100 billion in sales to those companies. If the royalty rate was more aggressive at 20%, Uncle Sam would get $20 billion a year from every $100 billion in sales. And that's just the start. Before you clutch your pearls, not that anyone listening to this has pearls to clutch, because that is gay. This whole climate thing, this whole idea, like the downside for the globalists with AI is that they have to actually refer to studies, and they if you put the studies in there, AI is going to say that this thing is way overblown, that the human contribution to this, the carbon levels emitted by humans sink into the ocean and are absorbed by trees at a rate exponentially higher than what is said by the climate science. So like that argument is going to be totally dismantled, and they'll look back, I think, on that in 20 years. If we win over globalism, we'll realize that we were Don Quixote. They were Don Quixote here, fighting these windmills that were never actually, I mean, I guess pun intended, they're building windmills that were never contributing to what they thought they were. I don't even think they believe it. I think some of them do, because I've been around some of those people, but in general, like at a big scale level, like everyone knows, like this green energy is terrible energy. Not only do the economics not work, but the quote green side of it doesn't work. And watching liberals burn down their Teslas right now, these lithium batteries and burning rare earth minerals, I mean, it says everything you need to know. So I am all about this idea of leasing this land to companies who can provide, like, we're already buying these rare earth minerals from China. We're already buying oil from elsewhere. Like, it's not like by not drilling here, by not mining here, we reduce our dependence on it. It's just that we're buying it at exorbitant rates from countries that are tariffing us. And so just scratch all of that. I mean, that take is ridiculous, but of course that's going to be the main talking point when they try to lease out these lands. All right, back to the article. Lutnick has also floated the idea of taking a 20% stake in the defense contractors that the U.S. military buys from. that could generate dividend income of 3 to 5 billion or so each year and provide the wealth fund with upside exposure to their stocks. Huge fan of this as well. Like these defense contractors, if you've been in the military, if you've been around contracting at all, you're seeing just obese, lazy people do a job poorly and make hundreds of percent more than an actual market competing for that job could do. It is a disgrace, the entire defense contractor industry. It's money laundering, like legal money laundering. It's ridiculous that this is allowed to continue. And if they audited, what we call aid to Ukraine, aid to other countries, they just slap a sticker on a expense item, which really is just going to Lockheed. Like it's the money doesn't even leave this country. It's ridiculous. And so I think that a 20% stake in defense contractors is way too small. But even if they do that, which is what they're talking about, that's a huge boon to our sovereign wealth fund. Lutnick, also talked about having the federal government acquire the American side of TikTok's business. TikTok currently projects $15 billion in annual US-based ad revenue. So 50% or more of that would flow into the sovereign wealth fund each year, depending on how the deal is structured. I don't know enough about TikTok and the numbers behind it. I'm spring loaded to be suspect of anything that our Congress tries to say about it. So if they're trying to say that it's this like malicious, Chinese operation, I'm like, well, it's probably our malicious operation, but I don't know. So I'm not going to comment on that. Then there's the Bitcoin play. Legislation is already on the table to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It would have the federal government buy 1 million Bitcoin over the next 4 years. If we assume a conservative market price of $100,000 per Bitcoin, that's $100 billion worth of Bitcoin. Now, Lutnick's firm, Cantor Fitzgerald, recently took a 5% stake in Tether, the company behind the US dollar stablecoin USDT. That gives his firm access to DeFi, decentralized finance, lending markets through which USDT is a major linchpin. But what if the plan is to take that $100 billion in Bitcoin and lend it out at 12% in the DeFi markets? That's another $12 billion a year in annual income. Again, this crypto side of it, I'm not smart enough on it to do anything other than read what Joe says about it. And let's not forget gold. The U.S. government has the largest known gold reserve, totaling 261 million ounces. That's $783 billion worth of gold at today's prices. Again, that goes back to $3,100 an ounce today, but they're valuing it at $42. This gold could be leveraged as collateral to invest in higher yield assets to produce tens of billions more in annual revenue. Put it all together, and it's quite possible that Lutnick will be able to generate $100 billion or more in extra revenue in year one. If left in the sovereign wealth fund, that extra revenue can be reinvested so that it can compound very quickly. Looking at it this way, it's certainly feasible that Lutnick could work up to $1 trillion a year to balance the budget. And as the sovereign wealth fund grows, so does America's financial security. That's how we can avoid a sovereign debt crisis. And here's the thing, this is just the first page of the playbook. Balancing the budget is the easy part. It's just basic math. The bigger picture will be much harder to accomplish. We'll talk about that next time. With Joe's permission, I will follow up with what he has next, but I think this is a really encouraging take on what could happen. And if even a fraction of this happens, the idea of like when they say inflation slowing, typically they mean inflation is still increasing, but at a slower pace. The idea of acceleration is a way to kind of couch and disguise the fact that inflation or whatever you're measuring is still happening. Like slowing the acceleration is not reversing. It's not decreasing, right? It's still, you're still progressing ahead, just at a slower pace. And government statistics, that's what they're doing. They're just kind of using statistics to create the narrative they want. And I'll close with one example. Statistics class I took in grad school were 3 of them, but stats 1, it was a public policy master's. And so the whole thing was in level 1, we're going to learn statistics. We're going to learn all about p-values and standard deviations and how to calculate all this. In level 2, you're saying, okay, you have a background. How do you take data, apply statistics to it, and get the outcome you want? And so we would have a policy question and a given data set, and you'd be paired up against another, group, and you'd say, okay, you guys need to make the opposite cases for the same policy with a given data set. Apply everything you've learned, apply these statistics, and make opposite points of each other. And the thing is, you could both do it convincingly. That's the whole point. So government statistics are essentially meaningless because it is I guess you could say you're buying the narrative you want. You're manipulating the narrative you want via statistical models. So this can be done, and we'll always get back to even if this isn't done, we are responsible for our own castles. We need to defend our own castles. But I really wanted to bring Joe's take on this to you because I think it's very important, and I think it's a great framework to view what's happening right now, because there is potential for major disruption here. And hopefully we're not disappointed and it's not just all talk, but at the moment it seems as if they're dead set on economically dismantling the fraud, waste, and abuse that's happening right now. And we should be all for it. So that's what I got to say tonight. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and hopefully next time we'll be back with Brian. All right, cheers.